Hey there, fellow citizens of the internet. Welcome to the Moses Kabandana Podcast. Today, I have with me Suzy, and we're gonna be talking about resiliency. And we're gonna take a trip down her memory, her past, and she's gonna tell her amazing story. And as she's telling us her story, we're gonna get to know her a little bit deeper, and hopefully, you and I can walk away having learned a thing or two based on the path that she has taken. So without any further ado, Suzy, welcome to the Moses Kabandana Podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm hoping I walk away with something I learned too. So that's the great thing about having a conversation. So I'm
Awesome.
Suzy. Yeah, I'm Suzy, and I'm just a girl. I mean, really, and the reality of it all, I'm just a girl who's trying to like figure out life and um, really enjoy it while it's happening. And I've been through some pretty intense things. I have a long journey, and I'm only 42, so it hasn't even been that long.
Yeah.
But I'm a wife. I am a mother. I am a widow. I am the product of chaos and dysfunction and um, all that comes with that type of upbringing. And I would say, you talked about resiliency. I'm a person who, by nature, is fairly resilient. And, I guess one of the things you had asked me about just as a warm up prior to us getting on this conversation was uh, the statement that I use around that I want to thrive, not just survive. And I think I don't know exactly when that particular like statement of words came into my thought process, but I think it's a
Hmm.
pretty good explanation of really what I've tried to do my entire life. Like I've always known that there's a lot of amazing things to being alive, and
Yeah.
being in this world and being in this place that we're at. So I don't want to just be getting by every day, and it would be really easy to just do that. But I
Hmm.
really want to thrive and enjoy this time that I'm in this world, I guess.
Okay. And speaking of in this world, where in this world are you? And were you born and raised there?
So I currently live in West Hollywood, California, and no, I was not born and raised here. I was actually born and raised in central Minnesota, which most people don't hear until I say Minnesota.
Okay. What
And
brought
I
you to
actually
Hollywood?
I just moved out here a little over a year ago. Um
Okay.
I have always loved California in general. I've traveled here several times over the course of my lifetime, and
Yeah.
I I love the ocean, but I also like the desert and I like the
Mm.
landscape, and I
Yeah.
actually really love um, the general spirit of the people that live out here. And I have a
Mm.
theory as
Mm.
to why they are the way they are, but I'd only moved out here last year because that was kind of my first opportunity to do it. So
Mm.
after my husband passed away, and I actually had gotten remarried about a year and a half ago. Um, and my current husband, he has lived in California a few times. He's from Minnesota as well, but he's
Okay.
not Central California, but Northern and Southern California. And so, and I'm a nurse. That's part of my career. Um, and so it was just sort of like, there's really not anything holding me back at this point from doing it. So we picked up and made the move, and we
Mm.
came specifically to West Hollywood, uh, partially because the two places at the time that I was interested in working at um, are close to here. Um, and I'm an emergency room nurse. That's the focus that I tend to, or that I've worked in for the last like 5+ years. And
Mm.
And specifically West Hollywood, right about 2 years before we moved out here, I had moved from a suburb of Minneapolis, St. Paul, into Minneapolis. And it was one of those things that I've always said, like, when I was younger, if I hadn't gotten married as young as I did, which was like 2 weeks after I turned 18, I would have probably lived in the city. But I grew up not grew up, but after I was married, I had a son. And so we very much did that, like, you know, small town or suburb, you know, neighborhood house with a yard, you know, a dog, all the stuff.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I'll just live, you know, if I look back and was like, hey, if I hadn't gotten married, where do I think I would be? I was like, I would probably live in the city, because that matches my personality a little bit better. And so, so when my son was finally ready to move out after his father had passed away, I was like, I am not staying in this big house in the suburb by myself. And so I moved into Minneapolis. And then when we came out here, I love the ocean, and eventually our goal is to get more on the coast, which is not very far from here. It's like 6 miles. But I specifically wanted to continue. I wasn't done with the city yet. And so West Hollywood is just kind of a fun, interesting place. And we live kind of in the middle of it all. So it's, that's how we ended up here.
Okay. Let me take you even further back then. Okay. What is your absolute earliest memory? Like, as far back as you can think as a human being, what is the first memory that comes to mind? It's kind of a tricky one.
I know. Really it's back. A good question. I don't have a lot of early memories at all, which is something that I recently just started questioning, because I did have something very traumatic that shaped my life happen when I was 12, with my mother. And I just kind of assumed, because I don't remember a lot, like, around that time period before and after, that it was related to that trauma or traumatic experience. But I've worked over the years and I've processed that trauma, and I recently started focusing more on the nervous system regulation, more the body focus around trauma, anxiety, etc. And I realized, it just kind of occurred to me that, like, I don't honestly really remember. I have maybe like 3 or 4 memories, like original memories. Now, as I've worked on some stuff, I have more memories, but like at the time when I had that realization last year, I was like, I don't think I remember more than like 4 things from before the age of 14, outside of, just a couple things. So it's a very interesting thing to realize, like, whoa, like I have a lot of blank space. But my very earliest memory that wasn't as the result of like looking at a picture or that sort of thing, ironically, is my my mom's youngest sister used to babysit us when we were really little. So this would have been like, I think it would have been like around the 2-3 year old mark. And she was a teenager at the time, and kind of a wild teenager. So my earliest memory is actually walking in on her and her boyfriend having sex.
Wow, what a memory.
Yeah.
Wow.
But,
okay.
That's really the earliest, that, without like having had looked at a picture of something. I mean, that's really my earliest organic memory.
Have you ever told her that?
I don't know if I told my aunt that. I know it's not a secret. I mean, my sisters and I have talked about it, but I don't know if I've specifically had that conversation with my aunt. It wasn't, nobody was surprised by this. Because, like I said, she was a teenager. So
Okay. My goodness, that's typically when I ask this question. Yeah, it's usually around 3 and 5 years old that
yeah.
people can remember. But this memory, this probably trumps all of them for sure. I gotta write this one down. I
Well,
should
I'm
create
sure
like
we'll
a
have some more.
montage.
Yes, a montage of everyone's like earliest
First
memories.
memories. Yeah,
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 I mean it's a great question because
yep,
it makes you question also like why do we remember the specific things that we remember?
yep, yep,
You know?
yep. And it's most of us don't question, like ask ourselves that. Like I haven't sat down and like asked myself when was what like what's my earliest memory. It's not a thing that I do, but I don't, I do
Yeah.
it to others. And it's also important because so long story short, but like last year this time last year I flew back to Mozambique, and I went to revisit a few of the orphanages that I grew up in, and
By the
I
way,
remember, yeah.
you definitely I look forward to more of your story coming out on your channel because that's
Okay.
something when you've told me a little bit about your background and there's a couple little things on your channel, but you have a very
Yep.
interesting story yourself. So, anyways, continue.
Yeah. I'm thinking about potentially writing a book. That's like a year or
You
two from
should.
now. But um, I just revisiting one of those orphanages. It forced me to rewrite some of the memories that I thought I had, right? Because I was like,
Yeah.
wait, I thought this room was this size, and I thought that this person might have come from this side, but they came. What was happening here? I just seeing things from the mindset of an adult, for good or for bad, right? Because
Yeah.
as an adult, we can, we have formulated and cemented our beliefs already, so we were not as malleable as we are in our minds
Yeah.
when we're little. But
We're also much
it just,
bigger. Like,
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
yeah.
So it just being there physically where I once was as a little ankle biter, it just reshaped a lot of things in my head. So yeah, just yeah,
Yeah,
highlighting the
I
importance
was
of
your
childhood memories.
memories. Yeah.
Yeah,
I actually it's funny that you bring that up because I was thinking about that as I was so part of my journey and trying to figure out when you have that big of a block of memory, like where there's nothing there, usually indicative of some sort of trauma. People don't just forget big chunks of time, right? Um, but it makes you question. So at the time, um, my first thought was to connect with my siblings, and I asked my parents, but I don't. They didn't respond. To talk about like what do you remember about me as a child, or like what do you remember
yeah,
about our childhood,
yeah,
and all of my siblings fortunately were willing to have that conversation, um, and it does spark some other memories, or like when we revisit some of the more impactful or some of the traumatic things that did happen. It is interesting how your memory is different with certain
yeah,
things. And then when someone else adds to that conversation and says, yeah, but remember, like, we did this and then
yeah,
this happened. And you're like, oh. And so I think it also just goes to show that when we have really impactful things that happen in our lives, and, people look at trauma as like, it has to be this big, like, massive thing that's happened to you. And
yeah,
trauma really is just any time that you're emotionally reacting in a large way to whatever the circumstances. And so, as adults, we might look at something and be like, it's not really that traumatic. But when you're little,
yeah,
I mean, anything can be traumatic because we don't have that cognitive ability to understand exactly what's going on. But yeah, it is interesting how your brain interprets and what it holds on to and like what's clear for you and then like the pieces
yeah.
that you forget.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, okay, so back to the timeline here. Uh, what were you like in the teenage phase?
The
Um,
teenage phase.
yeah, the wild type, the quiet, the troublemaking type, and in addition to that, in retrospect now, how do you think that your teenage years were impacted by the traumatic events that you had? You said around 12 years old.
Yeah, I mean, they were massively affected by that. So,
Okay.
when I was, so as a teenager, I would say, my interpretation of who I was somebody who was very, I mean, I was I was the crisis manager as a teenager in my family, and I know you
Okay.
had mentioned that a little bit, but um, I was the person who made sure that everything was like functioning and happening, and people were taken care of. Very much caretaker, which
Hmm.
probably
Hmm.
doesn't really. I mean, it's not surprising that I went into and was attracted to working in the emergency room, right? Crisis manager, taking
Yeah.
care of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Um, I wasn't a troublemaker. I did not act out. In fact, I was a really good kid overall. And maybe it's because I had such a high level of responsibility that, like, there's a level of maturity that comes with that, which is
Yeah.
not always
Yeah.
a good thing at that age, but you look at things differently. And so, like, my siblings, I would say, acted out more and were more wild children. And
Okay.
I just always saw, like, the potential dangers and that stuff. And so I wasn't really
Hmm.
a big troublemaker. And I also very clearly remember as a teenager, not that I didn't get into any trouble. I think, like,
Yeah.
every teenager goes through their phases, right? But I just
Yep.
remember knowing that, like, if I just tell my parents where I'm going to be, they're not going to
Hmm.
question me on what's going on. They know I'm here.
Yeah.
Back in that day, we didn't have cell phones and you couldn't track people, all that stuff, unless
Yeah.
you physically went and checked on them. But I mean, I just was always proactive. I think I knew that if I was communicative in that way, that, like, I wasn't going to be
Yeah.
followed up on, you know?
Hmm.
So I get to
And
have
it,
some fun.
and this high level of responsibility at such a young age, has that created any level of resentment in you? As in, like, why did I have to have so much responsibility where when I could have been, out there and doing what normal kids at that age do? Like, did that create resentment in you, or not really?
I don't know if it created resentment. I know at the
Hmm.
time, I'd say in my early 20s, I remember very distinctly having a conversation with my mother and telling her that I hated her because of everything that had happened.
Yeah.
I now think that it has more to do with the overall reason that I have a
Okay.
blank memory versus just that specific incident when I was 12. But
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think it made me very conscious of the fact, very conscious of um, working on my own, growth and development. And, I got pregnant with my son about 9 months after I got married. So, really, I think when my son was born, it was about a year and a half after that when I really started to put boundaries in with my family and create
Hmm.
space between me and the very, very trauma bonded relationship I had with my mother. Um,
Okay.
and it was because I was so conscious of all the things that I had dealt with at that age that I was like, I'm not going to create these patterns for my child going forward. So,
Yeah.
and I just going back to, like, that defining moment, because it's not like
Yeah.
something that I'm uncomfortable talking about. I've done a
Okay.
lot of work on it. I used to actually physically not be able to talk about it. Like, it was so weird. It would get stuck in my throat.
Yeah.
But I've
Yeah.
done a lot of therapy, a a lot of trauma work, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but when I was 12 years old, my mom tried to unalive herself when all of us kids were home. And she, I mean, clearly we had a very emotionally codependent relationship before that, because I think the fact that I even noticed something was going on is pretty indicative of that intuitiveness, or that like now as I continue to learn more about my nervous system, that hyper awareness, like hyper vigilant. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of responsibility at 12 when you realize that like your mom was literally an hour away from dying if you had not done what you had done, so it's like all of a sudden you start to take on this responsibility of, if I don't watch everything that is going on around me, like somebody's gonna die. So it definitely shaped me in a lot of different ways. But that was when I not only, I mean, I'm the oldest sibling, so I always have been kind of like a mom. I think that happens a lot with older siblings, especially females. But that after that point was definitely when I started to also become parent, or have a parent role with my mom and my dad as well. So
Can you unpack codependency? Because it's I don't know if something that is well understood, because from my understanding, having experienced it indirectly, it's not easy to spot, right? It often comes as a helpful thing, but so helpful that it disables you from being able to withstand on your own. So can you just help us unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that when you're in the middle of it, you don't see it. I think a lot of these revelations that I had about myself, and my own just growth and development, and emotional, work, it's the distance that it's like, when you're in the forest, you only see the couple trees that are next to you. You don't see the big picture. But when you come out of it, you can see the whole thing. And so, I didn't necessarily recognize it as being codependent when I was younger. But I guess the way that I would explain codependency is when you can't separate yourself from another person and be an individual, in that every move you make, every thought you have, every decision, all of that stuff, that person, it's all, again, you always give consideration to the people that are important to you, right? So like if you're married or you have kids or you're in a relationship, you have friendships, obviously like your decisions, those things are taken into consideration. But when you're in a space with a person where you don't know where you begin and that person ends, there's no individuality, and typically, codependency happens when two people are really emotionally unhealthy. I think the more emotionally healthy you are, the more you recognize that like everything doesn't have to revolve around this particular person. And, in my case with my mom, everything I did and thought and said, was with this lens of, if I don't stay on top of this, something bad is going to happen. And so, so you just start to lose that sense of independence. And then also typically there's a reciprocal, cycle to it. So it's not just you being unhealthy, emotionally unhealthy and attached to somebody specific. It's usually reciprocated, right? Like they have an unhealthy emotional attachment to you, and you can't get out of that cycle of honestly just emotional wellness and growth.
Yeah,
Codependency doesn't
yeah.
happen unless people are emotionally unhealthy.
Yeah, yeah, and it's probably harder to do when you're or to even recognize it when you're young, right? When you're that little.
I think it's hard to recognize when you're in it, period, even if as an
Mm,
adult. Again, like when you're in
okay.
it, I don't think you
Yeah.
always recognize. Sometimes it can just look like you really caring about somebody or you loving somebody. And so sometimes, um,
Yeah.
until you have. I'm a big proponent of like therapy and, continuing to develop and grow on all levels. And I think that, that can be a very common theme even in adulthood. If you don't have resources or other people in your life that are helping you see that, um, or if
Yeah.
you might see patterns that start to develop in your relationships as well.
Yeah. So
But
well.
yeah, I definitely didn't know at 12 and 13, 14, 15,
Yeah. Yeah.
up until my early 20s, that, what I had, the dynamic I had was unhealthy. I didn't know that because why would I?
Right.
Like, I was surrounded
Yeah.
by it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so that's a good segue into what would you say are some baby steps, right, that someone can take uh, to well to recognize, right, that they're in a codependent relationship, and then like the baby steps that it takes to remove themselves from that person, because you said it's a cycle, right? It's not just that
Oh,
you have an unhealthy emotional connection with them, it's the other way around too.
yeah.
So to recognize it and then start to take the smallest possible step that you can towards well, something that does not look like codependency.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that has always really stood out to me is that if a healthy relationship has boundaries, regardless of the relationship, whether it's a family relationship, a friendship, a
Yeah.
mother child, a father child, a spouse, significant other, all relationships have boundaries if they're healthy. And it's when there are no boundaries or no respect for boundaries that it's unhealthy. So I think that, one of the things that you start to recognize, if you're paying attention, right, as to
Yeah.
whether or not this particular relationship might be codependent or unhealthy, is first of all, do you have boundaries? Are you comfortable
Mm.
saying, these are what my boundaries are? And then
Yeah.
even if you are comfortable in expressing the boundaries or putting the boundaries in place, does that person respect
Yeah.
those boundaries?
Right.
And so
Mm.
I think that's kind of those are like the red flags. A big red flag of like a codependent or an unhealthy relationship. And I think the things that really help you start to create distance and take those steps away from that dynamic is resources. And sometimes you have to create your own resources. It's
Mm. Mm.
you don't it's not like everyone knows what's going on with you.
Right.
From
Right.
other people's perspective of my childhood and growing up, what they saw on the outside was not what the reality was. So there was
Yeah.
nobody to like step in and be like, here's here, let me help you. So I think, sometimes you have to just recognize that like you're not happy or this isn't good for you, and then start to figure out where do I find the resources I need to start to figure out what's going on or what. And I think it's the happiness level or the not even happiness. I mean, yes, if you're unhappy, but also, yeah, I mean, I think that if you're in a constant state of like hypervigilance or being anxious about if I do this person's gonna think this or say this or it's
Mm.
gonna cause a problem, and if it impacts your decisions or in your ability to express yourself in an authentic way, then I think that's kind of that time where you go, okay, like what resources do I have? And like, if I don't even know what I'm dealing with, but I can just recognize that this is not good for me, then even just the simple steps of finding information that helps you understand it better. I mean, in an ideal world, therapy is great, right? Because it helps you unpack that stuff, but not everybody has access to it. Not everybody can afford it. And honestly, there's still a lot of stigma about going to therapy. People sort of look at it as, if you're in therapy, there's something wrong with you. And realistically, you know, emotionally healthy people go to therapy because they recognize the value in that relationship. So, but if you don't have that particular resource, it's either, you know, trying to understand maybe what's going on in the dynamic or why you're feeling the way you feel. And then you do have to start to take a really hard look at, like, who are the people you're surrounding yourself with? So obviously when you're younger and you're growing up in your family and you don't have the power to necessarily remove yourself from that situation, and you do have to, you know, keep yourself involved on a certain level, you can start to look at, though, like, what are the relationships that you have outside of that? So are they also codependent? Are they also, like, are they emotionally healthy? And if they're not, then, you know, that's another thing, is starting to surround yourself with people who, you know, demonstrate a more emotionally healthy pattern, I guess. But it's not easy to recognize when you're in it. I think a lot of times it's a space. Gives you perspective.
Okay. Did you receive any pushback when you started to pursue something that closely resembles therapy, either from yourself or externally?
No. I didn't really start, like, actual therapy, I think, until my late 20s, maybe.
Okay.
Or maybe even early 30s. I worked a lot with life coaches. That was something that I was really exposed to in my 20s. That really started me. I think that, you know, that was a great way to start, because, you know, a life coach is really just asking you all the questions, right? Where you have to start to think about, like, okay, if this is a pattern I'm not happy with, like, what's the pattern and what needs to change? But I would say that my early experiences with therapy were not great experiences. And so I'm a huge advocate for pushing and shopping around for, you know, like, and any good therapist will tell you that if you're not connecting with each other, it's not therapeutic. So you have to be with somebody who makes you feel safe emotionally in order to do the work to get better, or to be in a healthier emotional space. And if you're not feeling emotionally safe in a therapeutic relationship like that, it's not going to work. So, you know, and I would say that that's, you know, pretty true of when I did finally start trying to look into therapy. You know, I was younger, and you don't really know what you don't know. So you know, it was like, oh, my insurance, I'll just pick a therapist. But I didn't like that experience.
Would you say that the reverse is true as well? Meaning, if you're connecting too much with a therapist. So if you both,
that
say,
is also not good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise you would.
Yeah, because I think it comes back down to boundaries, right? So, like, healthy, good relationships have boundaries, and in therapy, there are codes of ethics. There are professional boundaries that have to be kept. So if you have a therapist that's too emotionally invested in what you have going on and they're not detached enough from it, that's a red flag too, because there are some people, I think, that get into the profession simply because it gives them an element of importance and control. So not every therapist is a good therapist either. So, but I think, and also just personality wise, things change. You know, people, don't mesh with everyone. So I do think it's important, if you don't have a great experience, the first or even the second time that you go to therapy, that you continue to, look for the right person. And a lot of therapists, and I don't know how it is everywhere, but there in this area, or in the States anyways, there's a lot of a lot of therapists have like a introductory consult where because they also, the good therapists anyways, they recognize that it has to be a good space, or you have to mesh, and so I can't imagine that good therapists really want to work with clients they don't connect with either, because again, it would be frustrating if you're trying to help somebody therapeutically move forward and then it's not working. So most therapists will offer like a free consultation to essentially kind of figure out how you vibe and how you're going to work together and what the challenges are. And I think those are important. And I think sometimes people feel intimidated, like they're going to hurt their feelings, or, like, I can't tell you. I don't want to tell them that this isn't working because it's going to make them feel bad. But again, that's their job. That's, they know what this looks like. And, and so they often, I always tell people to try, if you're just starting into therapy, or changing therapist, to always pick 2 or 3 that you think you're going to connect with, or that might be a good relation, or, good therapeutic relationship for you. And go through those consults and meet with all of them, because sometimes the people you think you're gonna mesh with, you don't, and sometimes the ones you're not really sure you do. So well, so question here has got nothing to do with this. Well, I suppose it does indirectly, but how did you safeguard yourself from, you touched on it a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it. How did you safeguard yourself from the, I don't know if temptation is the right word, but from creating the same codependent relationship with your son? Well, one of the things I was really fortunate with, I guess, is the person that I ended up marrying at a young age. He was a very stable and grounded person. And so he's the one that actually taught me how to put boundaries in place. And it wasn't even, I don't even think he like realized that that's what he was doing. But that was just such a normal part of his personality that he was the person that actually pointed out to me that like the relationships that I had going on were not good for me. And so, so he helped me with boundaries. And then when I had my son, so like there's a lot of the cycles of, not only was there the codependency, but like, my mother came from a situation, or a long line of like the guilt tripping and the emotional manipulation and what we would call today gaslighting, all that stuff. And so it was a combination of my husband helping me recognize that these relationships weren't maybe good for me, and just being that support system of like, I wanted to set the boundaries, but you get scared sometimes, like, and it's not like it was easy. I mean, it took years and years and years. And even to this day, a lot of my family doesn't respect my boundaries, so I don't have a relationship with a lot of them. And so, but the big thing for me, the turning point in recognizing that I wanted to make these changes was, ironically, this is back in like early 2000s, so, it was right when people were starting to have more computers in their homes and things like that. But I remember, my son was about a year and a half old, and my mom and I were in an email fight of all things. Like, we were fighting via email, which seems moronic, but we also lived, I don't know, like 45 minutes apart. So I guess that was a good way to communicate. And I just remember sitting there and like being able to so clearly see it, like the manipulation, the guilt tripping, like the pattern of it. And then also, when my mom was, the whole time I was growing up, my mom would be like, I'm never going to be like my mother. She, because my grandma did the same things, the guilt trips, the emotional manipulation, like the whole thing. And I will never be like my mom. I don't want to be like her. And then you all of a sudden very clearly see, like, you are exactly like your mother. All the things that you didn't want to become, you became. And and then I think that's where I started to realize, like, there are these cycles that happen. And if you're not consciously making efforts to change them, you're going to just keep repeating them. And so as much as I would love to say, I'm not going to do that to my child, I knew just by seeing that in black and white that if I didn't actively make changes, I was going to end up doing the same thing to my child, whether it was intentional or not.
Yeah, well, what would you say was one of the changes that you proactively made and continued making in order to break this cycle?
Yeah, so the thing that I really worked hard on was like strong boundaries. So my mom was was not, like I said, we had a very meshed, trauma bonded relationship, and I think it was more than just what happened when I was 12. I think there's other stuff that was going on prior to that, but of course I don't remember all of that. But she didn't respect boundaries, and she still to this day doesn't respect boundaries. The world revolves around her. And so for me, it was really finally putting my foot down and being very clear about these are my boundaries. And then there being consequences if the boundaries weren't respected. And not only with myself, but also with my child. Because I think there was a point in time where I stopped letting her even watch him and she didn't watch him very much to begin with because I don't know, but she always had some reason not to, in general. But yeah, I mean, it was putting him down and then also really sticking to it, because the thing when you're dealing with someone who's emotionally manipulative, of course they don't want those boundaries in place because they get something from you not having boundaries. And so it's going to be it usually gets worse before it gets better. And that's very true. And it's been that way. Anytime I've put boundaries in place with somebody where I've had like an unhealthy relationship, is it gets worse before it gets better. And in this case, there was a point in time where my whole family was involved in like having this say, and I was the bad guy. It was my mom did her thing and worked the group of things, and so it was like every time I turned around I had somebody saying to me, but she's your mother, and like, why are you doing this, and all of these things. And I think had I not had my husband, who was literally a ride or die, like he had my back, and he wasn't going to let me be treated in any such way. So like and him being just reinforcing like, what you're doing is not wrong, like it's okay for you to be like, these boundaries are necessary. And then also I think there's that protectiveness that comes out from my child. When you have a child, it's just you start to realize, like, I just don't want this stuff to be happening again.
Wow. What is your current relationship with your mother? How is it, should I say?
We have no relationship. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And that has been her choice. She likes to pretend like it's my fault that we don't have a relationship. But I put clear, and there's not a lot of them. They're not complicated, but I put boundaries in place, in my mid-20s, and I very clearly communicated them over and over and over again, because she does this thing where she comes back around every so long and is like, I know I've messed up and I want us to have a relationship. Like, what do I need to do? I'm like, it hasn't changed. Like, this has been the same for the last 15 years. But the reality is she doesn't really want the relationship, because if you want the relationship, you'll make the changes or you'll respect the boundaries. She wants to be able to talk about it and get the attention that that comes from either, well, for me being the villain, is really what it comes down to in her story.
And how has that driven a wedge between her, your father, and your siblings?
I don't know if it's necessarily driven a wedge between all of them, but I do know there's if you look up on the internet right now and just put in toxic parents or something of the nature, there's I think it's a Psychology Today article, or there's some article that comes up and it talks about the toxic parent dynamic, and it talks about about how it creates this emotionally abusive environment, and that generally when you have so my mom was very emotionally manipulative, and I would say emotionally abusive, and then my dad was very absent, as in, I don't want to deal with all of this, so I am going to work a bunch, I'm going to do all this other stuff. And then he also just didn't handle stress well. So a lot of volatility in general in my family, a lot of chaos. And then we had 4 kids total, so all very close in age. And I think so it talks about the enablers in this dynamic, and enablers are people who are it was the relatives that I'd have would be like, but she's your mother, you need to why don't you fix this, all these things. And then they have what they call the flying monkeys, which perfectly describe, I would say, my siblings, in the sense that that toxic parent dynamic, they're so good at manipulating the situation. And again, as I dig into this deeper for myself, even now, I start to see how much they manipulated not only us as kids inside the family dynamic, but the perception of the extended family or people outside of our family, of all of us kids individually. And so I would say that they've definitely driven a wedge in any of my relationships with my siblings and some of my extended family too, because I am the scapegoat of the family. I am the person who they'll call in a heartbeat when they need help with something, but stab you in the back as soon as they've gotten what they need and when they're not happy about something. And so, and that's been my dynamic with them since I was young. And it just very recently has become extremely clear that dynamic is going to continue to not change, even with my siblings. And so, I've no contact with my mom. I haven't had any contact with my dad for probably about 3 years. And then my siblings, I have started to go low, sort of, I guess, working towards no contact with my siblings right now, because I just realized it's never going to stop.
Okay. Well, because that was going to be my next question is, and maybe this is stepping on your toes, but I was gonna say, what is it about you that allows yourself to keep running for the help when it comes, knowing that there's some backstabbing that's going to come later down the road.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
know, it's interesting. That's something that I've just recently started to unpack a little bit more.
Okay.
I think, well, one, in my family, when I talk about crisis manager, I mean, it's not like a normal, you know,
Okay.
like chaotic, dramatic family situation. I mean, it's like life or death type of stuff that's happening.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
at one point or another in all of my siblings' lives, there is, and my mother and even my dad, actually, there's been points where, like, had I not stepped in, they might not be alive. And so I think it kind of all goes back to that original feeling of responsibility of, if I don't take care of this, somebody is going to die. And so that feeling of responsibility. And I do think that because I was the oldest with my siblings, there's sort of that parental sort of feeling that you have towards them as well. And I think it's just recent. I think there hasn't been a lot that has sort of exploded in my family for the last 3 to 4 years. And so I thought my sisters and brother and I were starting to repair that dynamic, and that I thought that they were starting to see and appreciate, like, who I was, what I brought to the table, like see beyond, like, the narrative that has been created over the years, until something happened, and then it just happens again, and I get turned on by everybody. And then people don't realize that, like, even though I'm not super connected to my family, I still hear the stuff that they talk about, about me. Whether it's through mutual friends, or not even mutual friends, mutual acquaintances. I mean, I grew up in that town. It's not like I still don't know people. Like, word eventually travels. And so, yes, so you start to hear things, and then it's like, oh, I guess we're here again. And I think it wasn't until just this last year that I really have started to examine my patterns around that fully. Like, I recognized it with my parents, but I didn't necessarily recognize it with my siblings. And then as I've continued to work on, like, my nervous system and my patterns and things like that, I started to realize that, like, I always justified it with my siblings. It was harder to, like, break that off because I felt responsible for them in some way, in a different type of way. Like, it was easier to disconnect from my parents, but not as easy for my siblings.
Does the thought that this might be some more toe stepping on here, that like, because if it was me, if it were me, I think if this thought were to cross my mind, it would have terrified me. And here's the thought: because I seem to be distancing myself from everyone, maybe the problem is over here, not over there. That thought would terrify me, right? So, like, after doing all the work that I've done for personal growth, emotional and psychological recovery and growth, and being healthy, just if that thought had crossed my mind, like, wait a minute, I'm the one that's distancing myself from everyone. So, shit, it might be me. That would terrify me. So has that crossed your mind, and how have you wrestled with that, assuming that you have?
Yeah, I think that the way that it's not you is, does it show up in other parts of your life? And literally the only people I have trouble with are my family of origin, the people I grew up with. I don't have these issues with my friends, because as I started to become emotionally healthy and boundary setting and all of that, I have better friendships. I have more healthy friendships. I have, I was married for a long time. I have, an adult son now. I don't have these challenges with any other relationships in my life, except this group of people.
Okay, that's a good way to look at it. And also, it's like if you're manipulative and psychopathic, eventually you're gonna have to move because everyone around you is gonna know that you're the manipulative type. So you will find that the manipulative types, the psychopathic types, they'll ruin the relationships around them. And then when people come to know who they are, well, they just get up and leave and go somewhere else.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And I think the thing is, too, is that, I mean, I can guarantee if any of those people were sitting here having this conversation with you, their perception of this situation would be completely different, right? They would have a different story than what my story has been. And I think you get to a point where you realize what is necessary for me to be emotionally healthy and be at peace. And honestly, like, does it matter at this point that they have I know that they tell people different things. I know that I am the villain in this situation. But the reality is that the peace I have from not being involved in that constant cycle of being the crisis manager and, like, having to deal with all this up and down and the emotional manipulation and the backstabbing and all this stuff that goes on, all these games that happen. Like, my life is so peaceful. But the minute that I allow myself to think, like, oh, maybe this can be different this time, and I kind of step back in and start to try to rebuild those relationships, my life gets very chaotic and very stressful again. And so even if I was the villain in the story, even if it is me, I'm happier not being a part of that. So
did you had to fight against self-sabotage? So like, here's what I mean. So because you might have been used to this chaotic, gaslighting, backstabbing environment, and then all of a sudden there is peace, and peace is so foreign to your day in and day out that you just start to create problems to go back to something that closely resembles your normal, which is chaotic and backstabbing and whatnot. Did you have to
I don't know that I necessarily self-sabotaged in that I created emotionally manipulative environments or, like, created that specific dynamic because I'm very aware of that dynamic. However, I think there is a reason that I have a lot of chaos around me in general. So, like, I'm a person who's always late. Not always, but a good chunk of the time I'm, like, running behind, or I work in an emergency room. What is the most chaotic environment that you could possibly work in? An emergency room, and I think what was so interesting to me is I very much protected my peace in my home environment. So, like, with my husband and my child, like, I like things to be very just calm and peaceful and whatnot.
Mellow.
And I think where I would attract the chaos is over the years I would see something happening, or somebody would get me involved in something that's happening with my siblings, or something going on in the family, and I would step in to try to help and fix it. And then that would invite chaos back into my life. So I didn't necessarily sabotage myself in terms of, like, my stuff outside of that, but by not setting those boundaries a lot sooner, especially with my siblings, there was always something major going on, like, every year, some sort of, like, crazy thing happening in my family that needed well, it didn't need it. I obviously volunteered to step in and try to help, but it wasn't until this last year that I really recognized that it's just going to keep happeing. So, like, why am I inserting myself into this situation? It's not. It doesn't help me. So, So you definitely do recreate those patterns. They might not be in the same exact way, but there is a level of chaotic energy that I carry in my nervous
Okay.
system. So
Okay.
like my nervous system is very hyper vigilant. I would say I'm probably in fight or flight like most of the time. And
Okay.
this is all something I just became aware of in this last year. Also, the first
Mm.
year though that I've solely been able to focus on myself. My
Okay.
child has
Okay.
moved out. You know,
Yep.
he
Yep.
has his own life.
Yep.
My first husband passed away, unfortunately, like 5.5 years ago. My
Mm.
second husband,
Mm.
I'm remarried. I got remarried about a year and a half ago. But
Yeah.
when you get married in your 40s and he's early 50s, it's different. You know, like we're
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
much individuals. We care for each other, but we don't have to take care of each other. And
Mm. Mm.
that probably has to do with the fact that I'm also much more, I've worked on my emotional health over the years as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Okay.
I think this is the first time in 40 some years that I've literally just been paying attention to like what is going on with me alone. Like I've always worked on my mental health, but I haven't
Right.
paid
Right.
attention to my patterns
Yeah.
completely. I was like semi-aware of certain things, but not to the level
Okay.
that I've been paying attention this last year.
Okay. No, I asked that because like the thought crossed my mind because my energy levels are just so low, and anything that closely resembles trouble, I avoid it. Right.
Yeah.
I don't want to argue. Like nothing. If I could have a 10 by 10 foot wide bed with like a million pillows on it and a box of grapes, I'll just lay on there and sit there and just be still and just be, right? I don't like anything that disturbs my peace,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the downside of that is when I am in a situation where it requires confrontation in order for a fruitful outcome to appear, right? I avoid that too, right? So I have to like
Yeah.
remind myself that, hey, not all confrontation is bad,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's okay to engage in an argument, in a fight, because you want something, they want something, and
Yep.
most importantly, you're both looking for truth. And so
Right.
if you engage in this discomfort, something good is going to come out of it. So let's fight, or like let's argue. It's okay.
Yeah.
But that's what I meant by self-sabotage. Is okay.
Yeah.
It would be a self-sabotage for me because I would be like, I don't want a discomfort. I want comfort.
Yep.
But by not pursuing the uncomfortable, and then I avoid I skip
Yeah.
out on all the growth, right? I don't know if
Yeah.
that made much sense.
Nope, it totally makes sense. I think for me,
Okay.
that whole stepping in and trying to fix it for other people, and
Yep.
it's not just for everyone. It's like people that I genuinely care about.
Right.
That's where I invite chaos into my life, and that's where I start to
Yep.
cause trouble for myself. So,
Yep.
and I think because I have always been so used to things being chaotic, that
Yeah.
when things are calm and too chill, it's uncomfortable for me. And
Right.
it's not even like, which is funny though, because I also, when my nervous system gets too overstimulated, like I think my nervous system is at a high threshold already because of just
Okay.
all the stuff that's happened.
Yep.
And then when there's a bunch of added stressors that are put on top of it, I reach my limit really fast. And so then I definitely
Okay.
will go into like a shutdown, like a hibernation. I
Yep.
mean, there are times where I literally just totally check out and, might lay in my bed for like 2 or 3 days and do nothing. And it's,
Yep.
I'm learning more about like the various nervous system patterns, but like, they can, I guess the term for it is like a freeze pattern. And so I go back and forth between, being in like fight or flight or constant, like having to, hypervigilance, all of that, to
Yeah.
it being too overwhelming. And then I just like freeze and shut down. So
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to balance that right now. That's what I'm actually working on, is creating more balance in my nervous system.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, I'm literally just the beginning of this, figuring that out. So I don't know. I don't know yet, but I look forward to that. But I'm not a person that sits well. Like, I can do the shutdown thing, right? Where I just check out, watch TV, do whatever. But like, sitting in my body, sitting in my emotions, like feeling, not my head. I can intellectualize emotions like all day long. I could tell you everything about, you know, but like any sort of like work that involves actually feeling the emotions in my body, or, you know, paying attention to my nervous system and trying to like bring some of that down, that is uncomfortable for me. And those are all things that I just have started to learn about myself. I've done a lot of the head work in my time, and it's only been within the last year that I've started to like be like, oh yeah, I probably should fix my body too. Like, I have issues with chronic pain. I've gotten in a couple car accidents, so I have chronic headaches. I get, you know, I'm literally like, my muscles in my body are tight all the time. To the point that like, if I'll get, you know, regular massages and things like that, but it literally it's painful. It's not like enjoyable, but like just in order for my body to function. And that's not normal, you know, so that's not a normal state for your body. I've been very aware for a long time. I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Body Keeps Score.
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, it's something to definitely look into. And then there's another book that I haven't read yet, but I've heard is along the same lines around the nervous system. Anything written by Peter Levine, I think is how you spell or say his last name. But any trauma or any trauma, it doesn't matter how big or small it is, but everything that happens to us emotionally gets stored in our bodies. And and for me, I know why I do this. I think when I was younger, I very much disassociated. Like, you know, you had asked me a bit about like the crisis manager thing prior to us having this podcast episode. And, you know, in order for me to be a crisis manager or to manage all of that stuff that was happening in my family, I had to like lock my emotions down and put them in a box. And so there was a level of disassociation that happened. I have a few memories, and I'm still like unlocking that part of the puzzle from the blank period of my life that I don't remember. But I suspect that, I mean, obviously having a big blank memory is a part of disassociating. So that shutdown is a disassociation. So anything I've known for a long time that a lot of the physical things that I struggle with, the headaches, the constant, you know, tight muscles, the, you know, various chronic pain, probably has some sort of emotional component to it, but I have not been ready to dig into that until recently. And it's because, you know, going in and actually like feeling all that stuff and figuring it out is uncomfortable. So yeah.
Wow. Well, it's gonna be quite a journey for you.
And I think that just goes to show that it's never ending process, you know? So like,
yes.
You know, the stuff that I experienced when I was younger definitely still impacts me in some way or another. And, you know, I have to continue to work through that. But then as you go through life, you experience new things that have an impact on you, whether good or bad, right? Right. And, you know, I've had traumatic things happen to me as an adult. I lost a husband, you know, suddenly and unexpectedly. I've had really crazy, you know, like work situations and just different stressors that have caused challenges. So like it just never changes. You're always going to have to constantly work on it. And I think it comes back to the resiliency piece you talked about, is that I think one of the things that I was most upset about, not most upset, but one of the things that really struck me after my husband passed away was I wasn't angry that he died. I mean, I was more sad than anything else. I was sad that, he was gone. Yeah. I was mad that I had just gotten to a place, like at that point I had been doing a specific type of trauma therapy, and I had gotten to a point where I wasn't having panic attacks. I wasn't having a lot of anxiety. And then bam, he dies, and there's a whole level of new anxiety and panic and all this stuff that comes with it. And I remember being just like, I literally just got to this point where I felt like I had fixed it. And what I've learned is that it's, if you just, I think, start to have a mentality that life is always going to have something pop up at you. Like it just, we cannot live this life without challenges arising. And unfortunately, bad things happen. They just do. We live in a world where bad things happen. And so I think that if you're a person that feels like I've done all this work, it should just be done now and I should be okay, you're going to struggle with that ability to bounce back up and keep moving forward. I think if we start to come to a recognition that like life is always going to have these things that kind of come out at you, and sometimes you create the situations, and a lot of times we have no control over these situations. And so I think when you realize that it's always an evolution and a growing process, and that you like it's never going to end. It's, like I'm always going to have something I need to work on in terms of my own internal spirit. And so I think when you start to recognize that and just accept that, you can kind of roll with the punches a little bit better.
Suzy, at the beginning of this podcast, you said you are just a girl. You're one tough, wise, and resilient girl. And I really just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for coming to the Moses Kabandana Podcast. It's insane that it's been almost an hour and a half already.
That's insane.
Yeah, it just went by so fast. Is there something that you would like to leave the audience with as we're coming to a close here?
I think what I just said is probably the biggest thing, is just, you're never too old. I grew up with that a lot, with people my age now, like being like, oh, I'm too old for that. I can't do this. I'm too old. I can't, leave a job I hate. I'm too old. Like, I think in general, like, you're never too old to do something new. If you're not living, you're dying. So, you're not dead yet. So, like,
keep on living.
If there's something you want to do, if there's something you want to try, learning new things is what keeps us young in spirit. So, I think, and you just roll with the punches, because if you really let life get to you, I mean, I would just stay curled up in a ball all the time if I really just let it get to me, because shit happens.
Yeah, sure does. It sure does. If people want to keep up with you, they want to follow you, listen to your podcast, where do they go? Where do they find you?
Oh, yeah. So my son and I are doing a podcast. It's called It's Going, and we're telling the story of the loss of my husband, his dad. There's a journey that comes along with that, and a little bit of mystery, and a whole lot of realizations. And so we are on all the social media. It's just at It's Going Podcast. You can find us, and then we're on the podcasting platforms and YouTube. So it's just It's Going the logo says It's Going with Suzy and Isaac, but if you just type in It's Going, it should pop up. But we're on all of the stuff, and our handle's generally at It's Going Podcast. So
Okay.
yeah, so you can come and hang out with us some more. My child and I have some fun and interesting conversations. So
Suzy, everybody, thank you so much for stopping by and saying hi to my audience and sharing your beautiful message and story. Thanks again for coming to the Moses Kabandana Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Until next time.